Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we're going to talk about the validation of the SharePoint Framework client-side web part property values. And what that means is that whenever somebody is actually using the property pane to configure your client-side web part, how do we make sure that that input is validated based on your assumptions so that the end user cannot assign there whatever they want? We rather validate the entry based on the use case of the web part. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a Senior Program Manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today as a SPFX wizard is a Waldek Mastercard. So Waldek, will you do the intros?
Yes. Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastercard. I work at Hencor. I am Office Development MVP. Today I will be your SPFX wizard, and we will be talking about validating SharePoint Framework client-side web part property values.
That's really a mouthful as a title, but I think it actually clarifies what I'll be talking anyway. So
it covers the whole thing.
Exactly.
That's correct.
Exactly. It's a really descriptive title of the webcast as well. Now, before we actually go to the actual slides and demos, and Waldek is going to do a live demo. We're going to build the web part and validation live for you in the demo section, so you get those steps as well. And just a kind of an additional note on that one, we do have a tutorial on this one available from the dev.office.com/SharePoint in the guidance section of the SharePoint Framework web part guidance. But before we go to the actual slides and the demo section, just to quickly explain for those who might have seen this first time. So SharePoint Patterns and Practices is a SharePoint engineering-driven initiative where we help the community to learn how to do development on SharePoint, in SharePoint Online or in SharePoint on-premises. We provide code samples, guidance documentations, community calls, case studies, these webcasts, and a lot of additional assets for you as well. The themes are in SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Adding Model, Microsoft Graph, Office 365 APIs. A lot of that seems to be more on the SharePoint Online side, but no doubt there's a lot of guidance in our existing assets also for on-premises, and SharePoint Framework is going to land on SharePoint 2016 on-premises as well. AKMS SharePoint PnP is the address to remember. Now, let's actually get back on today's topic, and today's topic is really around validating user input with property pane. So when an end user is adding a property pane value, how do we actually validate that the property pane value is correct or based on our assumption? Obviously, it might be that in your particular case in a web part, it doesn't matter, but in certain cases, it might be useful to validate that if you're requesting specific values or options from the end user, they're giving you what is expected. How we do this is that we hook in the validation to property pane control properties. So in the code where we have the method which is responsible of defining the property pane controls, we essentially hook in the validation in the specific controls over there. There's two approaches which are available. So there's the inline validation, essentially meaning that we're validating the input directly in the code, or we can also do remote API-based validation. As an example, you're requesting, let's say, the use case, what we're going to do today, or in the sample scenario, you're requesting a list name from the site. And then if the user is writing that list name to the web part properties, you can actually validate does the list exist on the site or not. To be fair, for that particular use case, maybe a drop-down which is showing the available lists from the site would be better. But I think it validates it's a good scenario for showing how the scenario can be achieved. Whenever you're doing this validation, especially for the remote APIs, you actually want to consider the delay on the validation execution. So you don't actually start validating the entry immediately. You rather wait for the end user to complete and the remote API to be executed, because there might be obviously a small delay on getting responses back from the remote API. Anything else you want to actually add there, Waldek, on that particular topic?
No, actually not. I think you covered it all.
Excellent.
So easy.
Good. So easy. This isn't actually a super complex topic, but it's no doubt something what quite often needs to be done when you're doing a client-side development. So let's actually have a code example. And what does it actually mean? So on the left side, on the top, you can see the property pane text field. So this is the actual text field available and visible in the property pane. And for this case, it's for the description property. How we hook in the validation here is that we use the onGetErrorMessage method call, where we put this function call to the actual function which is responsible of the validation. And in this case, the function is validate description. And in that function, that's the larger area of the code on the slide, we are validating that the value is not null, its length is bigger than 0, and then we're checking that the length isn't bigger than 40. Well, obviously in this case, it could be something like you're asking an input what is shown in the web part, and you don't want that to be too wide, for example, in the web part from a styling perspective. Could be one use case. Any other use cases, Waldek, on this side as an example? Just thinking through the scenarios of validating. Obviously, if you're asking a number, you can actually do this kind of a checkup for a number as an example.
Yeah, so imagine also you could include this approach. Imagine that you would want to check zip code or phone number or an email. So all the things that you can quite easily check in code yourself, you can do it directly in line.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a good point. Good. And then the slightly more complex scenario, and this slide actually is slightly more complex, and we do know that the script or the presentation might get really small, but we'll link the tutorials for you in the video description as well. So in here, what we're doing is that we're using a remote API to check up on the given value. So again, we're using the onGetErrorMessage and validate list name, and in the validate list name code. So just to be clear on that one, the function, what we're seeing, the full code isn't actually visible there, but the key parts are. So we're first of all checking that the list, the value is given. When the value is given, we're then using the SP HTTP client to actually call against that particular the list, checking if the list exists on the site, and if the response is okay, the list exists, we are resolving this to empty string. If the response isn't okay, then essentially the list does not exist, and then we are resolving that with the description value, which will be then shown for the end user. And that's pretty much isn't it, Waldek, for this particular scenario as well?
Yes, and the one thing that's essential here is that when you look at the line where we bind the method to the onGetErrorMessage event, you see that we use the construct that this validate list name dot bind this.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that if we didn't do it, then the value of this inside the promise, where we call this contact SPHTTP client, the value of this there in that place would be actually the promise and not the web part. So with that, we would not be able to get the context. So with this bind clause, we ensure that the scope of this inside the method is actually the web part, and not the promise.
Absolutely. And then we're able to access the context and everything else what is available in the web part object. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yep.
Good point. Good. So that's kind of a high level thinking on the validation options. And let's have a look on this one in practice. So Waldek's going to show you this one in practice as well. In the tutorials, which are available in the dev.ops.com/SharePoint, we have a tutorial for this validation. The tutorial itself shows these two options as well. So the first one on the left is the inline validation, where we are checking that the description field value is based on our assumption. And then the picture on the right is for checking does the list exist on a site. Maybe, once again, for the scenario's sake, when you are dependent on a list in a site, maybe a drop down and showing the options of the lists in a site would be better. But the whole point being on the fact that you are dependent on an external API call. And this is just an easy use case to show the scenario for you. It could be something like validating an end user name against the user profile or something else as well. So you actually have that remote API call as part of the validation. But I think that's it from a scenario perspective. So let's actually have a look on this one. So let's flip to Waldek's computer and screen, and let's have a look on how do we actually do this one in practice. So how do we build this validation, and how do we make that one happen as part of the property pane entries. So Waldek, take it away.
All right. So let's have a look at how you can validate SharePoint Framework client website web part properties in practice. I've created a new project so that you don't need to wait on it. And here, let's just say that let's just see if it works. So we will run gulp serve. We will build bundle package and launch the workbench. And with that, we will be able to see whether the project builds correctly. I don't expect anything else, but just in case, to be sure, let's verify that everything works as it's supposed to before we start adding stuff to it.
Sure. And this seems to be a React-based implementation, so you use the React template from a Yeoman template.
That's correct. That's correct. So the workbench is there. Edge is already open. Here I can add the web part, hello world. I can open its properties, and there it is. There it works.
Cool.
So first thing that I want to show you is how you can validate the value of this property in line. So we will do two checks. We will first check whether the value is there. So assuming that you would have value that's required. And then another thing that we will check is whether it does not exceed a certain length. So with that, let's add these two checks. So we start by, let's collapse this one to make it a bit more readable. And then we add a new method called private validate description. And parameter for that one is value of type string. And we return back a string. And string that we return is the error message that occurs if the value is invalid. If it is a valid one, then we return an empty string. That's the way it works in SPFX. So here we first perform a check where we say if value equals null or value trim length equals 0, then we say return please enter description. And then we do another check. Let me align the code, and we do another check. So we say if value length exceeds 40 characters, then we say return description shouldn't be, let me escape this one, shouldn't be longer than 40 characters. Otherwise, we return an empty string. Right, so with that, we have our simple inline check. And for this to work, we have to hook it up with the text field that we have for our property here. So here we associate it to the onGetError message event that occurs whenever the user changes the value of the text field. And here we say this validate description bind this. And in this case, we could as well just do this. We could just call the method, right? Because we don't refer to the this keyword. So we actually don't use anything of the web part class. But if you did, then it would mess up the scope. So in this sense, it's always easier to remember. Just use this. Use the bind. Or use bind to bind the function so that you will retain the scope of the web part within the method, right? Because here, if we use this, then it would mean something else. So with that, we have our code in place. Let's save, and then the build task should pick it up. So we are rebuilding the project already. It detected that we did a change in the code, and now if we go back to Edge. And the page is already refreshed. If we go back to the web part and we remove the description, so now you can see our first check, right? We didn't enter any text. So first we have an error, description is invalid. And also see that whenever there's an error, the web part won't update itself. So here we still see the old value that we had. And now if we enter some text, now we see the text, right? And if we now remove it, we will see that the A stays here because the web part does not update itself whenever there's error in validation.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing, okay, so now let's try the other text. When we enter description that's longer than our length, right? So what was the text? Big brown fox jumps over the lazy dog?
Something like that, yeah.
Big brown fox. It's probably something else, but yeah. Big brown is good. Big brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and that
I think it was actually small brown fox. But anyway,
small brown fox doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's not long enough. So now there you go. So now we exit this, and now if we would type more text, there you go, right? So it keeps saying that the text is too long and it won't update the web part.
Yep.
So with that, we have really easy check implemented in line. And as we said, you can implement this approach whenever you want to check for easy things like required properties, length, simple patterns like zip codes, telephone numbers, emails, everything that you can quite easily check by yourself in code, right?
Yep.
So with that done, let's have a look at another case when we will try to see whether the provided name of the list matches a list existing in current site, right? So let's stop the web part because we will add new property. And for that, we have to stop and we have to rebuild the web part. So we go to our manifest, and here we add new property called list name. And initially, we will just leave it empty, right? Because we don't want to guess anything up front about the name of the list that the user would like to use. So we will keep this empty. Here we go to our iHelloWorld web part props interface that describes properties used within the web part. And we add it here as well. List name, and it will be of type string. Then we go back to web part, and here we add a new property for the property pane text fields, right? So here we say list name. Let's remove this one for now, and here we will say list name field, right? So we include label, and we have to add it here in log. So here we go to the mystring.d.ts, and here we say list name field labels of type string. And then we also include this string here where we say this guy will be list name. So with that, to verify that everything works as expected, let's go back, let's rebuild the project. We will say gulp serve, but this time no browser, because we want to, eventually what we want to do is we want to be able to check, compare the name of the list with a current site. And you cannot do that in a workbench that you host locally because that does not have access to a site, right? That's only the local workbench. So with that, we will use the hosted workbench in a tenant that we already have. So we will go here, and I already have the URL in place. Let me refresh the page so that the workbench will load the manifest. And here, when I add the web part to the page, and we open its properties, we can now see our description that we already have and our new list name, which is here. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to check whether the name that we add here, like my list, whether that matches a list in this site. So in the site that we have here, which is the /sites Contoso departments. So first, again, we will start with adding new method that we will use for the check. So we will say private validate list name. We will have the value as the name of the list, but here we will give back promise of string. And the reason for that is that because we reach out to an API, it's not immediate. It might take a moment for us to perform the check. And with that, we don't want to lock the UI, and we also want to do it in a way that the framework can pick it up. So with that, we resolve a promise. Or we return a promise. And now we have to return a new promise, and this code is a bit long, right? Because there are quite a few things that you have to do here. So if you look at how it works, let's start with this one. there's the void, because that's a method, basically. And the method has two parameters. So there's the resolve, which is of type validation error message, and that's of type string, and that doesn't return anything. And then there's another parameter, which is the reject method, which is of type error, and that can be any, and that doesn't return anything. So this is a bit long, but as you work with promises, you will get used to typing this and how it works, right? So here, the first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to call to the API. So we will say this context SP HTTP client get. And then we will call, so we want to reach out to the REST API within the context of the current site and check if the list that we have exists. So we will say the URL is this context, page, context, web, absolute URL, and to that we append the /API _ API web get list or lists get by title. Here we will enter our value, and then we will say, okay, we don't want to get the whole list because that's inefficient, and the only thing that we want to do is a check, right? So we will say select ID to make it simple. And also another thing that's good, right? Because the value that you get here is the value that user typed. And the one thing that you don't want to do is to take it raw, because if someone would enter a script, it could potentially break the whole page. So you want to escape it. And one easy way to do that is to import the escape function that's already available within SPFX. So here we can say import escape, and we do that from the Microsoft/SP low-subset, I think that's called. Is that correct? That's correct. So with that, we can now call here escape, and that will escape the value of any characters that are invalid or that are that might potentially inject in the script.
Yeah, except that you're missing the S from the escape, but pretty close.
What's that? Escape. Yes, escape. Yeah, because the S escaped already.
Yes.
Right, so yeah. And then another parameter that you have to do whenever you want to call the SP HTTP client get is the SP HTTP client configuration that instructs the client how to execute the call. And you don't need to do it by yourself. There's actually an easy way to do it. So you can go to SP or this context SP HTTP client configure. Oh no, it's a static, so we have to import it from here. So let's add another import, and we will call it SP HTTP client, but then with capital S and P, and then we do that from Microsoft SP HTTP. I think that's the module, and here we say SP HTTP client configurations v1. So that's the default set that instructs the client how to run the call. And then we say, okay, so this is a synchronous call. So we say then. So when we have the call, we get back a response. And that's of type SP HTTP client response that we have here. So we have to also import it to get the typings back. So we say SP HTTP client response, which is here. And then we can just copy paste that, and we say, so here then is, we will get response back of type response. And actually here we don't need to return anything, so we just say void. Sorry, incorrect. We'll do this, return void. And here we will check if response is okay, right? So if the list exists, if we can get the list, then we resolve the promise, which is the one here, with an empty string. And here we say return, right? So we won't run any other code, because the resolve is only calls the function, but does not stop the code flow. So we have to do a return here. Otherwise, if we couldn't find the list, we will have an error, right? And one way to check that is response status. So if the list isn't there, we will get a 404. So in this case, we can say something like list with name. So how about we print the name on the screen, and once again we escape it. With name doesn't exist in this site, and we also return it. So we stop the flow. But it also could be the case that we will get a network error. The API will be blocked, throttled, everything, right? So we could just get some other error. So we will just say else, and here we will say resolve an error occurred. Please try again, right? Because that error here doesn't have anything to do with the value that we provided. It's just error calling the API, right? And here we'll return that as well. And then optionally, what we also can do is to have generic catch. If something would go wrong, then we will have error, any, that will be also a void. And here we'll also say resolve an error has occurred. Please try again. And return. So with that, we have our check in place, right? So now we need to hook it up to our field. And again, we do it exactly the same way. So here we say on get error message, and this validate list name bind this. And this is exactly the case where the bind is essential. We need this here, because if we didn't do this, if we just pointed to the method, we would not be able to use the this keyword here within the context of the web part. This here would be scoped actually to promise. But this actually, we want this here to actually point to the web part that we build. So in order for this to work, we need to bind it on the scope to this here, which in this context here is the scope of a web part and not promise. So with that, we should have everything in place. We can go back to our browser and see if things work. Let's say yes, so we still run. All of that is okay. We had somewhere an error saying that we missed a semicolon. Let's just have a look at where it was. Line 9511. Let's just play correctly. Yeah, so here, semicolon, there you go. We rebuild the code. No warnings. All should be well now. Write manifest, so we package, build the code, we refresh the page, we go back to the hosted workbench, we reload the page. Now when we open the web part properties, you see that we'll get initially error, right? Because so we actually don't check. We require a name, but we didn't include it in our check. So how about we extend our check in here? So first we'll say, okay, if value is null or value trim length is 0, we will say resolve with error, please provide list name. And here we'll say return. Right, so we won't do any other check if there is no text entered. So let's save. Let's wait a second for the code to rebuild. It's there, page is refresh, refresh the workbench, open web part properties, and here we will say, see now, correct error, right? So we didn't enter any text and we want to see it first. So here let's enter my list. And we'll say list with name my list does not exist in this site. So how about we try to enter the name of the list that's there, documents. And that's good, we don't get any errors, so that means that our list works. And when you work with remote APIs, there's one thing to take into account. And let's have a look at this. So let me open Developer Tools. And let's have a look at the network stack as I type in this field. So I will say Documents. And here you can see that if I don't type fast enough, we will check every single value that we have. So here you can see errors that we had document. So basically every single keystroke, if I don't type fast enough, that will perform a check. And depending on your case, and actually depending on the value that the users are expected to type in this field, it might take them more time because they might need to look it up, or maybe they don't type as fast, right? So it's a shame that you would stress network and the API with checks that are incomplete. And the one thing that you can work around that is to extend the waiting period that framework waits before changes to the field. Right, so by default, it waits 200 milliseconds between keystrokes. Right, if there is no change, it will execute the check. If there is, it will wait again. Right, but that might be too short. So an easy way to change that is if you go to the property here, and here is another property that you can use called deferred validation time. And you can set that to 500, let's say, right? So with that, when we rebuild the code, let's see that it refreshes. Okay, that's done. Let's refresh the web part. And let's open property pane. And here, let's remove this one. And even though we won't type as fast now, we will see that the framework will work and will actually check the value only once. So we'll say, and even if we do a typo, we can easily correct it, go back, and there will be no additional checks. So with that, it's an easy way for you to control based on experience that you might have about users, how often the check should be done so that you won't stress the network and the API too much. So with that, I think we covered everything. Vesa, is there anything that you would like to add or ask?
Well, not really. We did cover everything what we promised, and the inline validation and the API level validation in a really, really nice way. Just checking through all of the different scenarios. So superb demo from that perspective. And just kind of once again pointing out, maybe the validation of a list in a text box isn't a really real world case because you probably want to actually expose the lists in a site using a drop down or whatever alternative way. But I think this shows the model how you can actually control the validation based on the remote APIs. And that was really the key point of the tutorial as well. But let's flip back on the slides and close up the webcast. Good. Thanks, Waldek, for that one. And I think actually, even though it's a relatively simple way to do that, or simple scenario, it's great to see that we have a native out-of-the-box API capabilities of doing this efficiently in the SharePoint Framework client-side web parts. I think this is a highly valuable webcast as well, because people quite often need to do the validations. So you might have some sort of a rules on a length or the format of the entry, and this really shows in a simplistic way how to get started on doing the validation within your client-side web part property panes. We absolutely encourage people to go through the tutorial, walk through the steps. The tutorial itself is a great one. It actually explains you step by step what you need to be doing to make these things happen. So you get a kind of a hands-on feeling on how to do this kind of things with your client-side web parts. Anything else what you, as a closing marks, Waldek, on the topic?
So you talked about encouraging folks to check out the sample tutorial. You talked about why we do it. So perhaps the one thing that I can add is that if you compare that to the past, it's way easier now to implement checking the values directly within the web part, and it's a thing that you definitely should do because it helps the users to set up the web part properly. right? So when they add it to the page, it will make it easier for them to ensure that the values that they enter are correct and are intended, as opposite to trying to enter a number in a text field or the other way around, right? So it's definitely a thing that you should be doing whenever you can.
And that's actually a good point. So let's actually spend slightly of time on that one. So if you think about the classic, let's say, a server-side web part, farm solution web parts, even with those, this kind of a validation was relatively hard to complete. Well, obviously, you had more flexibility from an API perspective, but still, the implementation of that, you had to actually take care of the whole validation scheme and everything else by yourself. The other kind of a thinking point is that what about scripted web part based, let's say, modifications? With those, you actually don't have even a property pane. So having this kind of validation, making sure that the end user is guided through to give the right values, is a super easy thing to do with client-side web parts, which is no doubt one of the benefits of the client-side web parts as a platform to do customizations. But I think that sums up the webcast. So thank you, Waldek, for joining me once again on the client-side web part development guidance, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. See ya.
Yay!